of 2 Kings 14 tonight, and hopefully moving into chapter 15. A couple of things I do want to make mention of. First is, we did these a while ago, this survey of Bible history. We had a number of them printed, and they were all taken and distributed, which is a good thing. But we have more of them, and they're out in the foyers on the tables. And that's not all that we have, so if you're wanting to grab a few, we have plenty more, I guess is my point. So don't feel, I don't want to take the last one. You won't be taking the last one. We've got several. But some of this in Numbers 14, 15, and 16 of this really relates to the dates and different things that are going on with kings. And so this could be somewhat helpful in that pursuit as well. Also, this is my version of it. I've got a bigger version of it here. I've been talking about this for months, and I finally did it. That is, I did it for y'all. I made one for myself a long time ago. But this is a chart of the kings of Israel and Judah with their names, the years that they reigned, the co-regencies, which obviously is pretty self-explanatory. A co-regent, it's usually a father and son reigning together for some particular reason. And we're actually going to run into one, Azariah, tonight in chapter 15. He'll be a co-regent for several years. And so the kings of Judah are in red and the kings of Israel are in blue. I did it in Ole Miss colors because I know you're good Christian people and you would be concerned about that. So I have that, and then there's a short description kind of each king, a significant thing or two about them to kind of help you navigate. This is something that when I'm in the Kings and Prophets, I have to kind of keep it in front of me all the time and just make sure of where I am in history. And so I have these here. I will leave them on one of the, or maybe even both of the back tables back there, and you can pick those up if you want them on the way out. Right. So then last week I kind of felt like there were a lot of stunned looks, and so I kind of felt like I moved a little quickly. And don't worry, we're not going to repeat it. I'm just going to offer you an apology, and we're going to move on. And so I want to try and keep focused on what's going on within the book, and it's very easy to get lost with what's going on. And hopefully when we're done, I've got a notepad where I keep these notes jotted. We'll go back and just kind of overview the high points of this is Israel's rise. It hits its zenith, and then we'll talk about those just little points along the way where they fell off and ultimately where they crashed at the bottom. And so hopefully we'll be able to do that and press forward. So in 2 Kings 14, at the very end, we're in verse 23 with the reign of Jeroboam. Your Bible may say in, your little headings that take place between paragraphs, it may say Jeroboam II reigns in Israel. And I think we mentioned this last week, but we'll say it again. Jeroboam II, he's called Jeroboam II to distinguish himself from Jeroboam of 1 Kings chapter 12 and chapter 13, and maybe a little bit of 14. And the reason why that's done is, well, first of all, they're two different people, but second of all, they're from two completely different families. They're in no way related to each other, okay? And so Jeroboam II is just an easy way to kind of differentiate. This Jeroboam II is actually from Jehu's household. Jehu was a central figure in destroying Ahab's household. And because of that, he was told that his sons would sit upon the throne for 4 generations. And so Jeroboam II is one of those. So, verse 23, in the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, which of course we read about in the first part of chapter 14. So this is roughly 782 BC. Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria, and he reigned 41 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. He restored the border of Israel from Lebo-Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was from Gath-hepher. For the Lord saw the affliction of Israel was very bitter, and there was none left bond or free, and there was none to help Israel. But the Lord had not said that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, so he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam the son of Joash. All right. So here he is. He's following the same steps that they all did. They're all staying with the calf worship, sometimes branching out to Baal worship like with Ahab, but mostly staying with calf worship. 1 Kings 12 at the end, 28 to 32 will tell you about it. So in verse 25, though, it says, he restored the border of Israel from Lebo-Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah. So Lebo-Hamath, you may jot 1 Kings 8:65 is one of the furthest points of the kingdom when Solomon had control of it. Okay, 1 Kings 8:65, he kind of mentions these boundary markers. The sea of the Arabah would be the Dead Sea. And so he's talking about, this is another way of talking about the whole nation from north to south. And so he restores that border. Now, I think we mentioned last week, but we'll say it again also here, is that Jeroboam II ushers in a time of prosperity for Israel. Okay? They call it the Indian Summer of Israel. It was very short-lived. It looked like things were turning around. Part of that had to do with Assyria was occupied with Syria. So those two monkeys were kind of off of their backs. And they were kind of free, and they made a pretty good living. And as a matter of fact, Amos actually speaks against the abuse of wealth. Just hold your place there. You don't have to turn. You can if you want to, but I'll read it. Amos chapter 6. Amos is preaching to the north. He is from the south, but he is called to preach to the north. And he speaks and says this, woe to those that are at ease in Zion, which of course is Jerusalem, which is not his direct target audience, but Zion is not the only capital mentioned. Those who feel secure on the mountain of Samaria, there's the north. The notable men of first of the nations to whom the house of Israel comes. Pass over to Calneh and pass over to Hamath and go down to Gath of the Philistines. Are you better than these kingdoms, or is their territory greater than your territory? His point being, God has destroyed capital cities and nations continuously, and nations that were bigger and better than you are. So there's no sense of, you're at ease in Zion, you think everything is great. But, verse 3 says this, O you who put far away the day of disaster and bring near the seat of violence. That is the first part of the verse, put away the day of disaster. You're saying it's not going to happen. God's not going to punish us. And then you bring near, okay, the seat of violence. So it's a kind of a juxtaposition. You push away and say God's not ever coming, and so you continue to bring people to you, which Amos is really concerned with their treatment of the poor. So you bring near a seat of violence. You mistreat people because you feel secure. He says, woe to those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp and like David invent for themselves instruments of music. That's not talking about music in worship. That's talking about musical instruments for the purposes of entertainment. And contextually, that is the idea here. Verse 6, who drink wine in bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but they are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. So they're partying. They're having a great time. The music is playing. They're drinking, but their drinking is excessive. It's not in cups. It's out of bowls. They are very wealthy. They anoint themselves with the finest of oils. They have the nicest of everything, and it doesn't bother them at the sinful condition that they are in or their nation is in. And so that's why Amos speaks so pointedly about this and says, y'all have no idea what's coming. You think because it's easy right now it's going to stay that way. It won't. And by the way, the reason you have it easy is because in the opening oracle of the book in chapter 2, he said, you've sold the poor for silver and the righteous for a pair of shoes. You mistreat people. So Jeroboam II brings into Israel, the northern tribes, great prosperity, but spiritually, they're as bankrupt as they've always been, if not worse, especially in their mistreatment of others. And so he helps them to restore their borders a little bit, which the God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was from Gath-hepher. And this is the Jonah that we read about in the Minor Prophets, Jonah. Now, I honestly wish we could stop there and study Jonah, because kind of understanding what's going on here helps us to really understand Jonah. But let me say this. Jonah is not about Jonah running. Jonah is not about a fish. Jonah is not even about the people of Nineveh repenting. Jonah is about Jonah. That's the point. Okay, so understanding this historical context will help us to understand Jonah much better. So when people say Jonah runs in the opposite direction that God calls him to, and it's true, it's direct opposite. God calls him to go northeast, he goes southwest. He calls him to go over land, he chooses sea. I mean, everything possible to go the complete opposite of what God told him to do. So, Israel, as we said, Assyria was weakened. Syria was weakened. Israel's at the height of their day. There's no one to oppose them. There's no one to threaten them. And then God sends Jonah and says, I want you to go preach to the Assyrians. Now, I've heard a lot of reasons in my life as to why Jonah didn't want to go to the people of Nineveh, because they were cruel and they were this, that, and the other. And that's true, they were. But Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh. It had nothing to do with their cruelty. Nothing to do with it. He says at the end of the book, when God talks to him outside of the city in chapter 4, he said, I knew this was going to happen. I knew you're a merciful and gracious God. You're a pushover, and I knew you'd forgive them, and I didn't want you to. I wanted you to obliterate them because they're the only thing that's standing between Israel and utter prosperity. I wanted them to burn in hell. That's exactly what Jonah said. Exactly what he said. He didn't want them to repent. And by the way, because they repented, 60 years later, they would be the very nation that destroyed his nation. Jonah is one of the darkest books in the Bible, actually. And the scary thing is that what we find in the recesses of his heart that God pushes to the surface are actually sitting in the recesses of our hearts as well. And it really, really makes me uncomfortable when I study it, which is probably a good thing. But Jonah not only went to Nineveh, he also served at God's pleasure at this time as well. He prophesied that Israel's borders would be restored because God looked upon them in their affliction, and had compassion for them. And so, verse 26, he said, For the Lord saw the affliction of Israel was very bitter, and there was none left, bond or free, and there was none to help Israel. But the Lord had not said that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven. So he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam the son of Joash. God used Jeroboam II to kind of rebuild them a little bit and give them a second chance, or 537th chance, whatever it may be. And so he saved them through Jeroboam, specifically raising him up. Let's see, blotting out the name of Israel from under heaven. That comes from an old practice of having papyrus reeds. Papyrus was the common writing medium of the day, where you take the papyrus and you lay it out in your strips, and usually about 4 strips across wood or across stone, and then 4 strips the other way across that stone, and then you put pressure on it, and the natural sugars and things in it bind it together, and it was basically the only writing medium for a really long time. And but it was washable, and so you could blot things out. You didn't have an eraser, but you could get some water and you could blot it out. So that's kind of the idea of blotting out a person's name. Or, a lot of things that we think about in the Bible are actually filled with images from their culture. For an example, we think about the book of life. People talk about the book of life all the time. The book of life is playing off the registry in the city that kept a record of who was alive in the city. That's what that was. I mean, not for certain, but I'm pretty sure even our city, our county, has a register somewhere of the people who are living. That's what he's talking. He's making a play off of that image to talk about the book of life. You belong in that city. Another one might be in Genesis when they die. It says he was gathered to his people or gathered to his fathers. That had to do with the fact that they buried them in family sepulchers. They buried them together. And that image is used to describe something far greater in the process. So there is Jeroboam and Jonah, and then 28. Now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam and all that he did, and his might, how he fought, and how he restored Damascus and Hamath to Judah and Israel, which shows you Damascus is Syria, so it shows you Syria's weakened state. Damascus is actually Syria's capital. And so all his deeds are now written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And Jeroboam slept with his fathers, the kings of Israel, and Zechariah, his son, reigned in his place. So basically, they squandered their last chance. It's about to get pretty chaotic and pretty ugly pretty quick. Okay? Matter of fact, I jotted in my margin, squandered their last chance. It won't be long now. Because in this next chapter, there are 4 assassinations of kings of Israel. 3 of them in a space of 13 years. I mean, it's just chaos. So, that's chapter 14. Any questions or anything on it before we move to 15, which I don't think will take us too long? Okay, so to summarize 15, this is it. The chapter opens looking at Azariah, king of Judah, okay? The kings up here, these two, Azariah and Jotham, are Judah. Zechariah, Shallum, Menahem, and Pekahiah and Pekah are all in Israel. And so the chapter opens with Azariah, or as he's mentioned in this chapter as Uzziah. But he becomes Israel's second longest reigning monarch at 52 years. And Jotham is his son. Now, so the chapter opens telling us about Azariah, and it closes telling us about Jotham. And in between, you have this sandwich of Israelite kings, okay? So all these Israelite kings fit between Azariah and Jotham, somewhere in this 52-year gap. And I should probably write that. Okay? So somewhere in those 52 years, you have Zechariah, Shallum, Menahem, and then Pekahiah, and then Pekah. Okay? So that's how this chapter is put together. And I probably should have done a lot more of this in the past. That's my fault. To kind of explain what the chapters are doing instead of constantly just mentioning it and moving on. We can kind of see what's going on. So, chapter 15, verse 1. Guess it would help. But we're on. There it is. Okay. In the 27th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel. So it's kind of reaching backward to Jeroboam to help us understand when Azariah comes to the throne. Azariah, the son of Amaziah, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 16 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. Now, he is one of these co-regents. His dad, Amaziah, you remember, was captured as the hostage and kept in Samaria for many years. And so he became king in the place of his father. His father was the technical king, but he was in captivity. And so now Azariah, or Uzziah, is kind of serving as king in his father's absence. Okay, so that's why they call it co-regency. Basically, his father is a lame duck, and he's really the guy doing everything. Okay, his mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. Nevertheless, the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places. And so one of the things you see here is that he's not compared to David. He's compared to his dad. When you make the comparison to David, it means you completely reject idolatry. When you make the comparison to a dad, you're not completely rejecting it. Okay? You're not practicing it, but you're not necessarily forbidding everybody else to practice it. And that's why he says the high places weren't taken away. Okay? And I would encourage you to look at 2 Chronicles 26. Actually, we'll look there in just a second, so it doesn't matter. So, in the reign of Uzziah, there were several prophets who were preaching. Okay? Several prophets. First, there was the prophet. Now remember, Azariah is in the south. Okay? So there were prophets preaching in the north during his reign. The prophets Hosea, you can read about it, chapter 1 and verse 1. They were working during Jeroboam's reign and during Azariah and Jotham. And you also have Amos, who was also preaching in the north at the same time he was reigning in the south. The year that King Uzziah dies, okay, after his 52-year reign, the year that he dies is when Isaiah starts. That's Isaiah 6:1. In the year that King Uzziah died, saw the Lord seated upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple, and so forth. And so you're seeing now in the north, well, I guess I could write those things down, couldn't I? Amos, Hosea, Isaiah at the very end, so he kind of like fit right here. Okay, and Isaiah will preach kind of to both of them. He's kind of a limbo type prophet. He lives in Jerusalem, but he preaches against the north, and then the north is taken into captivity, and he continues his preaching against the south. And so we've got these three, and then actually a little bit later, you're also going to have the prophet Micah preaching as well. Okay? Isaiah is about 755. Micah is about 735. Micah's a little bit younger in the process. Both of these guys are around 750, 755. Okay? Any questions about that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't think so, because they themselves are not worshiping idols. They're not criticized for that. The only note that they are criticized for is the fact that they didn't press a national resurgence. It says the people continued to worship at the high places. The kings themselves did not. They practiced things as they should. And so it's more of a rebuttal of the people. The king didn't exert all of his force, but he wasn't idolatrous himself. That's kind of the idea. It's a good question. All right, anything else? Okay. Now we get this in verse 5 about Uzziah. He's an interesting case. It says, "And the Lord touched the king so that he was a leper to the day of his death, and he lived in a separate house, and Jotham the king's son was over the household, governing the people of the land. Now the rest of the acts of Azariah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And Azariah slept with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the city of David, and Jotham his son reigned in his place, which of course we'll see him at the end of the chapter. Now here's the story. I'm just going to quick summarize because we got about 5 minutes. But 2 Chronicles 26, you can read it for yourself, 16 through 20. So Azariah is a very good king. God prospers him because of his faithfulness. It says that several times in the Chronicles text. At some point, it's not exactly clear why, he just gets puffed up and his pride moves him to go and offer incense in the temple. The only problem with that is he's not a Levite. That's forbidden. So he goes into the temple. A bunch of priests try and stop him. He keeps wanting to go for it. And then all of a sudden there is a leprous boil that appears on his forehead. And he becomes a leper for the rest of his life for going up against God's holiness and breaking God's order and basically believing he was above the rules in that particular occasion. Now, what's interesting to me is when you look at Isaiah 6, when he says, in the year that King Uzziah died, so everybody knows Uzziah is a leper, and everybody knows why he's a leper. And then you see God in this grand image of holiness, and you never have to question why Isaiah goes, I don't really know what to do here. No wonder he confesses he's a sinful man. His king had been taken off the throne most likely for 10 years, the last 10 years of his reign, because of his rebellion and then leprosy. And of course, as a leper, he had to be cast out and live in a different place. And Jotham was a co-regent with him for a little while. And so all right. He's going, but we're going to do this real quick. Okay, Zechariah. The chaos is going to begin. In the 38th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, reigned over Israel and Samaria 6 months. And he did what was evil on the sight of the Lord, as his fathers had done. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, with which he made Israel to sin. Shallum, the son of Jabesh, conspired against him and struck him down at Abalim. And it may have been, I think the NIV there actually reads that it was like a public execution of some kind, and put him to death and reigned in his place. Now the rest of the deeds of Zechariah, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. This was the promise the Lord gave to Jehu. Your son shall sit on your throne, shall sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation, and it came to pass. It says that in 2 Kings 10, 30 through 32, and also in Amos 7, 7 through 9. And so this is the end of Jehu's house. Jehu, the one who did away with Ahab's house, this is now the end of his house. And next week, honestly, it will not take long because there's not a lot said about these kings. Because the point that the narrator of the story is trying to get us to see is that nobody really lasts very long, and it's really just the same song, just a different verse. And so it's like that train is really headed downhill, and it's just picking up steam, and it keeps going faster and faster and faster and faster. And you and I both know that you see unstable regimes all throughout the world, and what is common about those unstable regimes? You have coups, you have different kings. I mean, there's just that constant lack of sturdiness. And we look at those countries and many times refer to them as third world, and that's basically what Israel is becoming. After being the leader of the world, they become third world. So anyway, we'll pick up there hopefully next week and then steam ahead.